an individual that has been involved intensively in politics and in the American scene for many, many years. Mr. McWilliams is very well known to Chicano activists in California, even though he makes his home now in New York. Mr. McWilliams, as editor of The Nation, has been able to be in a position, at a vantage point, to make some very important commentaries about the American political system. But what we would like to do today is sort of draw on his experiences, especially during the 1930s and 1940s, experiences that I think are very, very fantastic as far as the activities that Chicanos were involved during those years. Specifically, we will look at such things as the repatriation of the 1930s, the early 1930s, the Zoot Suit riots of June 1943, and perhaps other things such as the Sleepy Lagoon case, which he was very much involved with. Mr. McWilliams, can you give us a little bit of your background in California during those early years?
Well, I came to live in Southern California in the early 1920s and went to liberal arts and to the law school at USC and practiced law for a time in Los Angeles. And then when Culbert Olson was elected governor in 1938, I went into the state government to head an agency known as the Division of Immigration and Housing, which had a lot to do with migratory workers, and we had a responsibility to inspect labor camps and that sort of thing.
Right. During your early years, I guess, as an attorney, you really had quite an active role in the Los Angeles community. Looking at the early 1930s, the Depression and the circumstances that arose at that time, there were many different attitudes about the causes for the Depression. And from some of the readings that I have made from authors like Rodolfo Acuña and other historians of that type, they maintain that generally there was an attempt, I guess, in society, in some sectors, to make scapegoats of some individuals for some of the economic problems at that time. You were involved, I guess, quite a bit during the repatriation. Can you take us back to some of the circumstances, attitudes of the 1930s and the role that many of the different groups in society played in that part of history?
Well, to begin with, in the wake of the stock market crash in 1929, the authorities became concerned, of course, about welfare, aid, that sort of thing. And they were also concerned because in the 1920s, Mexican Americans in particular had shown certain tendency to want to organize. They had sort of organized on a nationalistic basis rather than a regular trade union basis, but there was that tendency. And so they thought that they didn't need them because they were cutting back on production and the huge surpluses were building up. And so they decided that they would ship the aliens in particular back to Mexico, and the way they did it was simply cut them off the aid rolls and send them back. And this was also, this tendency was facilitated by the fact that the Dust Bowl migration into California was starting at the same time, and so-called Okies and Arkies were beginning to come in the early 1930s. And they were, to some extent, replacing Mexicans as farm workers and so forth. So there was a big move on to get the Mexicans out of Southern California and back to Mexico.
Right.
And I witnessed some of the repatriation trains that left from the Southern Pacific Station in Los Angeles at that time. It was an extraordinary sight. They left usually very early in the morning. And you would see these families with all of their belongings and whatnot being,
on the trains,
herded on these trains and shipped back to Mexico. Of course, not so many years later, I dare say many of them came back.
that was the case, right?
Because that was always the case. It always has been the case.
Right. What were the figures, approximately? As we were talking not too long ago, this historian or sociologist by the name of Hoffman has done some work on that, but what approximately were the number of people that went through this process?
Well, I would hesitate to trust my recollection about it, but there were thousands. This was not just a minor few hundred or anything of that kind. There were very large numbers of Mexicans who were sent back.
Rodolfo Acuña, in his book Occupied America, states that during this time there were approximately, he uses the figures, around 250,000. And that, of course, the railroad participated very, very much in the process. Looking at the point of civil rights, was anything done during this time to guarantee or to safeguard the civil rights of many of these people?
Not a thing. Not a thing. I mean, it was just done like that. And of course, the figures are in some controversy because the records were not well kept. And you can get varying figures. I encountered this problem at the time, and some of this later research is based on a longer look at the records, more careful look. But I noticed that the people who have been responsible for this research have also experienced difficulties because the figures are not exact.
Right. Well, looking at not only the repatriation, but later incidents where the Mexican-American community was in some shape or form in confrontation with the society at large. What were some of the attitudes? This morning you were talking about some of the attitudes, of course, that have existed to bring about such confrontations in society. Can you kind of take us back and give us some idea to the attitudes at that time?
Well, they were the product of intense ignorance, and they had prevailed for a long time, and no one had ever challenged these attitudes. They had just been repeated endlessly. And for example, we had a Captain Ayers who was in the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office at the time, and he would go around making speeches to service clubs and the like, in which he referred to Mexicans as being the descendants of the Aztec Indians who engaged in blood rituals of one kind or another and engaged in human sacrifice, and he said that there was a culture of the knife. The Mexicans had something, a real thing about the knife. And he would spout this sort of nonsense, and people would listen to it, and perhaps to some extent it affected their attitudes, and even elected political officials, some that I knew quite well, and I used to remonstrate with them about why they would sound off this way when they didn't know anything about it. They really
incredible, really
incredible. Really incredible.
Right.
And
what about the role of the newspapers? I guess that was quite a...
Newspapers were very bad in this respect. They would repeat a lot of this, and they too did not understand. And at the time of the Sleepy Lagoon case, at the time of the Zoot Suit riots, the press played a very, I would say, very harmful role. Not so much through any kind of malevolence or anything of that sort. They just didn't understand.
Right.
We didn't have any Ruben Salazars on the Los Angeles Times at that time. In those years.
You mentioned in northern Mexico that in your chapter on the Zoot Suit riots, you mentioned that at one point the newspapers would even report alleged confrontations between Pachucos and police or sailors or servicemen, and in essence almost creating a scene in itself.
It really amounted to a kind of incitation to commit acts of violence. They went after these so-called Pachuco youngsters, and they tried to identify them by dress and haircut and and so forth. And they really gave them a bad time. Those riots were not very pleasant things to witness. I saw some of it. I didn't see all of it. And there was a lot of violence. They went right into motion picture theaters and grabbed them out of their seats and took them out and roughed them up and all this sort of thing.
Your descriptions in northern Mexico were very, very graphic. I could tell that you personally were somehow touched by the incidences that were taking place during that time. what was the general feeling, I guess, of society at large, the majority of the population, when they would read about the so-called Zoot Suit riots? What I'm getting at is, what was the average man's perception of what was happening at that time?
Well, they were caught up in the sort of the frenzy and the folly of the riots, and yet at the same time there was a section of public opinion that was truly shocked that something of this kind could have happened in the middle period of the war, with probably very serious repercussions so far as attitudes in Mexico.
Right.
It was quite a serious thing. And I think there was a section of public opinion that wanted to respond but didn't know quite how to respond. So one of the things that happened is that Attorney General Robert Kenney, who was an old friend of mine, came to Los Angeles very hurriedly and said, well, we have to do something about this. This is a very critical situation, and it has repercussions, implications. And I said, well, if I were you, I would get Earl Warren, who was governor, to appoint a citizens commission to make some inquiries and to calm public opinion at least, and straighten out the factual situation a bit. So he said, well, who would you suggest? And so I named some individuals to him, and clerical leaders and others who were outstanding public citizens. And he said, okay, I'll speak to the governor about it. He did, and the governor said, appointed these people, Bishop McGuckin and others. And then they held a hurried meeting, and the commission, or committee, asked Attorney General Kenney to prepare a report, a rough draft of a report about the facts of the riot. And he came to me and he said, you prepare it. You prepare the draft report. And I said, that's a little sticky because I'm not a member of your staff. I have no connection with the Attorney General's office. You forget about it because there isn't time. Something must be done immediately, and so forth. So I did put everything aside and really got into it and put together a draft report and met with the committee. They went over it in detail, made their own changes, et cetera, and then it was issued by them and forwarded to the governor. The papers picked that up, and that had a sort of quieting effect on the attitudes. It wasn't an in-depth report, obviously, because it was done in great haste, but it did have the essence of the situation.
Do you think that since that time, any of the individuals who were directly involved in that have perhaps had any attitudinal kind of change?
Well, I'm sure that it had an impact and it had effect, because out of that investigation report came a Council for Civic Unity in Los Angeles that was set up to cope with, to try and understand problems of this sort and do something about them before they erupted in the form of riots and violence. And this Council on Civic Unity was in existence, for quite some years, more than a decade, I would say, and it did a reasonably good job of, largely in the field of community relations, trying to get better attitudes and understandings. Not that it did anything directly itself, but it was a good public relations kind of effort.
Looking at, again, the 30s and 40s, what were your observations during this time of organizing efforts by Mexican Americans, or Chicanos as they're called now? I think oftentimes Chicanos nowadays have a tendency to perceive that somehow there's been an overnight effort for organizing, on various levels. And I think that it's important to realize that people have been organizing for a long time. From your vantage point at that time, what were some of the things that you remember about Mexican Americans, Mexicans, and their efforts to organize in whatever kind of activities they were doing this?
Well, there's a long history of attempts at self-organization on a community basis or otherwise. They were rather fumbling attempts and they didn't have much continuity to them, but there were many such attempts. And in the trade union field, I mentioned that in the 1920s, there were several different attempts that they made to organize unions and that sort of thing. And then when the Sleepy Lagoon case came along, there was a committee set up to raise funds to provide legal counsel and that sort of thing. And this committee had quite an appeal to the Mexican-American community in Los Angeles. They supported it. They took, I think, quite a bit of pride in the fact that it was a successful effort. We raised quite a lot of money, had to, for that appeal. And when the convictions were reversed in a very splendid decision of the District Court of Appeals, the Mexican-American community came in droves to the Hall of Justice. They were all around the Hall of Justice. I would say several thousand or more.
And what year was this?
And I can't think of the exact year that this was. And this was reported in the press in Los Angeles and in Mexico as the first outstanding celebration of this kind that the community had had, where they had won an outstanding victory.
This was in the early 40s.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Looking at agriculture, there were many attempts from many different groups in the 30s to organize. I know Kern County has a rich history in this regard. What were some of your experiences, especially drawing from such work as Factories in the Fields, which is another publication of yours? Can you tell us something about this?
Well, I got interested because of the civil liberties implications. And, for example, the Civil Liberties Union once in Los Angeles asked me to defend some Mexican Americans who had been arrested in connection with a strike of citrus workers. And I went out to Whittier to represent them in a Justice of the Peace Court action. And I had never met them, had no opportunity to interview them, and I did the best I could for them. But what impressed me in connection with their trial was the fact that here you had a typical citrus belt community. Those communities are so charming on the surface, and so quiet and so peaceful, and the churches are covered with beautiful ivy, and you can't associate violence and unrest with this kind of community. And when I began to dig into it a bit, I found that the individual growers didn't have anything to do with labor relations, that they had turned all that over to the California Fruit Growers Exchange, and that it was the exchange that was setting the conditions and so forth, with no organization on the part of workers, which was grossly unfair because the exchange had all kinds of power and resources, and there wasn't even a union here to speak for the workers. So that made me very curious about the whole history of farm labor. In the state, I began to make some trips up through the San Joaquin Valley and to visit some of the big agricultural establishments in this area. And I got quite an eyeful of, for example, there was one place, but of course it was a tense situation because there had been attempts to organize farm labor. And the growers were very apprehensive because in certain instances, the left-wing people, communists and others, had taken the lead in trying to form unions or had been active in unions. And so they were apprehensive about this and pretty jumpy. And for example, I was ordered off a couple ranches by armed guards who thought, that we were, that there was no occasion for outsiders to be coming in and looking at conditions and so forth. And that was the general kind of attitude that prevailed. It always seemed to me that it was inevitable that agricultural workers in this state should be organized because farm employers are so well organized in this state. At that time, they were organized either in particular industry associations, as in citrus, or the tomato growers would be organized, or the cotton growers, they would all be organized. They would meet in advance of the particular labor operation, let's say cotton chopping. And they would meet in advance of that, and they would fix a rate. They said it was a minimum rate. It was, in effect, a maximum rate, because that's what they all paid. But they would fix that rate with no representation of labor and no hearing from the community as to the fairness of the wage and so forth. And at one point in the Olson administration, we had a situation where workers were protesting in this area, and all up and down the San Joaquin Valley. They said they shouldn't be cut off the relief rolls and forced to take jobs in chopping cotton in the spring because the wages were unconscionable. And I talked Olson into the idea of setting up a wage rate hearing board that would come down, hold a hearing as to the fairness of what a fair rate would be, and then fix that and say, unless they're willing to pay this rate, then these people can't be cut off the state relief administration rolls. We held that hearing and we made a recommendation, and I'm embarrassed to tell you about the recommendation. We recommended that none of these people should be cut off state relief rolls unless the growers were willing to pay 21.5 cents an hour. Imagine that, 21.5 cents an hour. Well, I want to tell you, if we had napalm bombed the San Joaquin Valley, we couldn't have raised a bigger outcry and a scream of protests than that recommendation. You would have thought we had absolutely upset the whole situation. 21.5 cents an hour. Well, that was the general kind of situation, and I still believe to this day that sooner or later there has to be some form of collective bargaining in California-style agriculture.
Right. What were the conditions specifically for farm workers at that time? You did a lot of investigating and certainly did a lot of descriptive kind of work in your book, Factories in the Field, which was received, I guess I could say, with mixed emotions in Kern County. You can tell us about that later also. But what were some of the specific characteristics of farm workers at that time?
Well, by the time I was in the state administration, the Dust Bowl influx was that flood tide. And between 1935 and 1938, I guess maybe 300,000, 350,000 Dust Bowl migrants had come into the state, and they were the prime group in connection with many crops. And the camp conditions were intolerable. This agency that I headed for 4 years had the jurisdiction of inspecting all labor camps in the state where 5 or more people were housed, 5 or more workers were housed. This included hundreds and hundreds of agricultural labor camps, lumber camps, mining camps, railroad camps, etc. And we used to go into these areas and look at some of the labor camps in the San Joaquin Valley. Unbelievably bad, unbelievably bad. The public was not aware of this. You could drive the highway, the main highway, and you could look in either direction. You wouldn't think there was a labor camp anywhere around. You couldn't see them. And you'd take a side road and get off the main highway, take a few turns, and there suddenly would be a labor camp with 300 or 400 people, families, and so forth. And in the spring of the year, particularly in connection with cotton chopping, very, very bad weather, very bad conditions. There was hunger and very serious health conditions in these camps. And we tried for 4 years to get growers to improve conditions in the camps. And over that period of time, they spent about $3 million at our prompting, our insistence, as a matter of fact, because we had the power to take them into court if they didn't meet certain conditions. And they did, to some extent, improve the camps. And the Farm Security Administration, federal agency, came in to the picture, and they had some quite good camps. But there were many, many grower camps in the state that were far below the minimum standards of the Farm Security Administration.
What was the response to your book in California, in Kern County, in Bakersfield?
Well, this community around Bakersfield was I think, very outraged by my book and also by Steinbeck's book. The two books, just by pure chance, happened to be published a week or two apart, and the certain groups here elected to regard this as put-up job of some kind, and it wasn't all, because the truth of the matter is, and I've said this many times, and people still find it hard to believe, I never met John Steinbeck. I never knew him in my life, and yet the two books came out at the same time, and they were denounced, and there were, I think The Grapes of Wrath was actually banned in Kern County for a time.
And your book was almost banned. What stance did the growers take with your book?
Well, they didn't like the book at all, of course, and they were very, very irate about it, and so naturally I had my run-ins with them when I became chief of the Division of Immigration and Housing, because they regarded me as a particularly obnoxious character, and while there may be some truth in that, nevertheless, I was trying to enforce a state law.
Were there any cries of communism or?
Oh yes, all kinds of red bait, but I was subjected to that for years, and I've over the years sort of gotten used to it, so it didn't bother me very much.
Well, looking to the present, to the future, even though you've been gone from California for quite a while, can you give us any projections as to what you anticipate may happen with Chicanos in the state as far as organizing is concerned, taking into account the experience that you've had in the state?
Well, I have great confidence in their ability to work out their own future, because this is a very important minority element in the United States. It's historically important. It's important because of the areas in which they are concentrated and located. It's very important because of the situation with Mexico and the relations with Mexico. And there has been a change, quite a remarkable change in the public's attitude about this particular minority. And in addition to this, most impressively, I think, are study programs such as yours, and the fact that you have now a sizable nucleus of graduate students in the major universities. There were none, really, in my time. And you've developed, the Mexican Americans have developed a very substantial middle-class leadership in all kinds of communities, in Texas and Colorado and elsewhere. They are politically becoming very important. Not as important as they could be with better organization, and particularly this voting registration act is changed. They will become a major factor in politics in Texas, Arizona. Well, of course they are already in Arizona. And in Southern California, in California generally, and in Colorado, Mexico. I have great confidence in their ability, as I say, to work out their own future.
One quick last question. What does New York, does the East Coast know that Chicanos exist?
We're very much, in the East, they're very much aware of Puerto Ricans. We have a huge Puerto Rican minority in New York, and Puerto Rican minority in Newark and in New Jersey and Philadelphia and elsewhere. There's also a large Spanish-speaking Cuban group, and increasingly large numbers from the Dominican Republic and illegals, so-called, that come in from Venezuela, Colombia, and so forth. But they're not aware of Chicano. The word Chicano wouldn't have much...
That's what I was looking for.
That's right.
Well, we certainly have enjoyed your comments today. I think that we're going to be able to fill in a little bit more some of the gaps from your book, North from Mexico, and some of the other publications that you've had. And we certainly appreciate your taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you.
It's been fun.
2958 is in the middle.
Okay, fantastic.
Very interesting.
How do I get this? I mean,